Back in March 2010, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service declared that the greater sage grouse was warranted for a listing as a threatened and endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. The bird was precluded from a formal listing then because of higher priority species. A looming final decision has spurred federal agencies, local governments, and private citizens to work together towards plans that will stabilize the bird's population. Welcome to the county seat. I'm your host, Chad Booth. Endangered species listings are not new to the West. We have seen the Utah prairie dog, the desert tortoise, wolves, and the spotted owl come listed in the last 2 decades, all of them with some debate, but none like the sage grouse. So why are so many people talking about this 6-pound bird about the size of a chicken that depends on sagebrush for its survival? The reason is simple. While there are a number of threatened and endangered species listed within the state, their impact is limited to rather narrow geographical footprints. A listing of the sage grouse, on the other hand, would impact vast swaths of lands in 11 western states. We will talk about the challenges of a listing later in the show, along with what is happening with planning efforts to avoid a listing entirely. First, it is important to understand the relationship between sage grouse and sagebrush habitat.
They're tied very closely to sagebrush, and sagebrush is an important plant species for a variety of wildlife, not just sage grouse, but big game, passerine birds, game birds besides sage grouse. So it's an important ecosystem for keeping balance, especially in the West. You know, it makes up a large proportion of the state of Utah and the West in general. And so because sage grouse are so tied to sagebrush, they're kind of an indicator of how the sagebrush systems are doing.
While sage grouse are highly adapted to using sagebrush for their survival, they have not been able to adapt to changes in the landscape.
In many of the places where sage grouse exist, the sagebrush has been converted to agriculture or towns. You know, they've had roads put in there. Sage grouse need very large expanses of sagebrush to exist.
It's kind of not one cut, but 1,000 cuts that are kind of impacting them. Development, gas and oil exploration, development and so forth. A lot of that really impacts sage grouse habitat, which is, you know, some of the bigger factors. And then out here, ravens are probably the biggest predator of sage grouse eggs that there is.
While there isn't any one single reason for the decline of sage grouse, every impact is somehow based upon the size and quality of the habitat. Settlement and development of the West has changed the landscape, creating less sagebrush. That encroachment can concentrate the birds into smaller areas, leading to more impact from predators. There is also the compounding effect of anything that can impact sagebrush, such as fire, invasive weeds, drought. And they can at some point impact the sage grouse. While you might be thinking there's no shortage of sagebrush in Utah, sage grouse do require more than one area of sagebrush for their different survival functions.
We call them a landscape species. They encompass a broad spectrum of habitat use and really landscape use across their range.
Sage grouse need very large expanses of sagebrush to exist, hundreds of square miles even, to fulfill the full year-long life requirements.
Most of the sage grouse populations are in what we call sagebrush steppe. A lot of western Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, those kind of areas that have large tracts of endless sagebrush habitat. And Utah is really quite different. Our habitat is naturally fragmented, a lot of different vegetation types, communities, elevations, those kind of things. And our sage grouse use that landscape a lot differently. We have birds that travel a long ways to nest, that take their broods to lek, to winter, those kind of things. And everybody wants an easy button where they just, this is how it's going to be. We're going to protect all of the sage grouse habitat by just putting buffers and rings around their mating areas, their leks. And we've always stressed that while those things are important, it's more important to know your grouse.
The hundreds of square miles of habitat that sage grouse require to prosper is one of the major concerns surrounding the potential listing of the sage grouse in the West. When we return, we will talk about what a listing could mean to the West and Utah in particular.
You go through the day-to-day repeating what you did yesterday. Don't you wish you could access that piece of your life that's missing? Find the beauty, serenity, family fun, or anything else that's missing from your life in the Cedar City, Bryan Head area. Gain access to your adventure, whether it's camping, hiking, the arts, festivals, or just a getaway. Visit cedarcityayl.com for details on all the adventures that you can access in scenic southern Utah.
Why is it that environmental protection and economic development are often placed at odds with each other? In Duchesne County, they have both. Here, modern industry and resource development go hand in hand with some of the most pristine wilderness in the western United States. A strong economy balanced with a lifestyle of exploration and discovery. But don't take my word for it. Go visit them. Duchesne County, close enough for business, far enough to get away.
Remember those good old days? The places you went with your family when you were young? Reinvest in those old memories by making new ones. Beaver County is the perfect place to start that new tradition. Enjoy your favorite pastimes with family and friends. Connect with the history and culture of Utah in a place that's looking to the future. Modern conveniences minus the hustle and bustle of other locales. Beaver County, your adventure starts here.
This potential listing of the sage grouse, I think, is one of the most important issues facing the state of Utah.
Welcome back to the county seat. If you are just joining us, we have been talking about the potential listing of the greater sage grouse as an endangered species. In the last block, we discussed how the loss of habitat has caused a decline in sage grouse populations and the large area of sagebrush habitat that these birds require. It is that scope of area required by sage grouse that has raised so many concerns, particularly in Utah, where we have only 8% of the total sage grouse population. Under a listing environment, it doesn't matter what portion of the population is in your state. Management of that species will be controlled at the federal level rather than by the state.
One of the major problems we see is the possibility of the impairment of the use of land, and not just public land, but possibly private land if the species were to be listed as endangered.
What would happen if it was listed?
A number of people ranging from federal land managers, state and county officials, and private citizens have met a number of times to discuss this topic. To get a better idea of the continuum of impacts that are associated with sage grouse, it is helpful to sit in on one of those meetings. Larry Christ, U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
In the event of a listing, I can safely say that life would get more complicated, but perhaps it wouldn't end. As we look at it, I think the primary concern for the part of most people is the additional regulatory mechanisms that would kick in with a listing of the sage grouse under the Endangered Species Act.
Fragmented populations of sage grouse occur in a number of different areas across the state, with a 50-50 distribution of the birds on private and public lands. The concern of private citizens, governments, and land managers is that the potential listing makes the sage grouse a determining factor in how a project will take place on both public and private lands. This could mean a reduction in access for roads, further reductions in grazing, less oil and gas development, if it has the potential of impacting sage grouse.
Let's talk about what this really means if we were to end up with a listing, because then that bird becomes more important than people's personal property rights. It would affect development, it would affect corridors, it would affect almost everything that we do. We're not saying that the bird doesn't need protection, but let's be reasonable in the way that we go about and do that.
Sage grouse are currently under the purview of the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, but under a listing, the state's involvement takes a back seat to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Greg Sheehan, Utah Department of Wildlife Resources.
We would move from an environment of collaboration to contention. It may not look a whole lot different in some areas. In other areas that are more populated, where there's more issues on the landscape as far as be it livestock grazing, oil, gas, all the different sorts of multiple uses that are out there, it would put us certainly in a precarious situation. A listing of the Greater Sage Grouse takes the authority out of the state's hands and it gives it to the federal government. Once they've got that control, basically any actions on the ground that would have and it could be expected to have an impact on the sage grouse would have to go through a federal review process.
But additional layers of regulation and bureaucratic red tape are not the only worry of stakeholders. Under a listing, there is a good chance that both funding and people will simply walk away from the issue.
Millions of dollars have been poured into conservation projects, pinyon, juniper removal, other types of activities that really help stimulate the habitat so that it's good for the sage grouse.
We've put over $60 million in Utah into conserving that bird. Honestly, a lot of the money that's going there now is to try to avoid a listing. And if this bird is listed, it will completely change the tone and the mindset of how we're able to work with industry partners, with private landowners, and even sportsmen that are bringing money to us to help preserve and keep this bird from being listed. A lot of those dollars will walk away from the table and they won't be replaced. The best conservation that can happen for the sage grouse is happening right now.
Although we can't be sure of what a listing of the greater sage grouse will bring to the West, there are a number of examples of problems that come out of the listing of any species. There's probably no better example in the state than the Utah prairie dog. All one needs to do is head down around Cedar City to see some of the issues a threatened species listing can create. That has been and continues to be a contentious issue as private citizens and local governments fight to get the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to work with them on a number of different problems, such as prairie dogs in cemeteries, airport runways, and the golf course. When we come back, we'll look at what plans are being made in order to keep the sage grouse from being listed in 2015.
Unlimited opportunity for adventure. It's all about knowing where to look. ATV adventures, rock crawling events, art festivals, and wildlife events. The opportunities are limitless. Plan your stay and join us for the Utah High School Rodeo in Delta, Utah, May 16th and 17th, and the Old School Rock Crawl. Pick your adventure in Millard County.
If you like the outdoors, there's not a better place to be. And like today for us, for instance, how many people did we run into? I mean, we really, you know, you've got this beautiful land pretty much to yourself, and where do you want to go? You want to go there? Go there. You know, it's wide open. It's amazing.
Isn't it time you found the balance you've been looking for? Uinta County, Utah.
Imagine a unique, breathtaking cascade misting into the deep pool below. A world-renowned national scenic byway that snakes through some of the greatest views in the world. A canyon painted red by the hands of time. A land that brings the Wild West back to life. And it's all in one amazing place. Here's some advice when visiting Bryce Canyon Country. Take your time.
Color. It's something that can be seen. But have you ever wanted to reach out and touch it? Experience it. In San Juan County, Utah, color comes to life like nowhere else on earth. Color can be more than an abstract. Color can be your gateway to a new world. Visit San Juan County and explore the past, present, and future in a way that you've only dreamed of. San Juan County. Color your experience.
Utah is absolutely committed to conserving sage grouse and to working to support thriving, robust populations throughout the state.
Welcome back to the county seat. If you're just joining us, we have been discussing the potential listing of the greater sage grouse as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. So far, we have covered the unique aspects of the bird, its habitat, and the impact that a listing would mean in the West. But let's shift gears now and look at Utah's state plan for sage grouse management, along with its current planning efforts on the public lands. Protecting the species and avoiding a listing has led to major planning efforts across 11 western states. It can be confusing because there are so many plans in various stages of completion on both public and private lands. Currently, Utah is implementing its sage grouse management plan that was completed last year. On public lands in Utah, the BLM and Forest Service are wrapping up joint planning efforts that affect resource management plans across 8 field offices and 6 forests. Utah's plan identifies 11 sage grouse management areas and provides protections for 94% of the sage grouse population in the state. While the plan got some kudos from federal agencies, they did have some issues with the plan.
One of the big ones is that over half of the habitat in the state of Utah is on private lands. And it's our choice that those people will be invited to comply with conservation measures on a voluntary basis. And the service would like to see the counties administer ordinances that really limited the use of the private lands. One of the benefits Utah has had, though, is we've got site-specific research that's been done. We are way ahead of the curve, and we do have a lot of good information.
The first research done on sage grouse was done in the 1930s. The Division of Wildlife has been collecting population counts since the 1950s. So it's been a species that we've been paying attention to for quite a long time.
And sometimes the information that the service wants to apply comes out of more like the prairie grasslands, and that's a totally different kind of ecosystem. So we are trying to raise the awareness of the fact that Utah is entirely different, but also that the areas where sage grouse congregate in Utah are different from one another.
On the ground, it is apparent that a single plan that focuses on the same issues affecting sage grouse won't be effective because each region has its own challenges to management.
Even within the state of Utah, we could not put together a one-size-fits-all plan that was going to be effective. So we defaulted back to the working groups that had been established in the mid-90s under the tutelage of Utah State University. And they have been mentoring these groups. They've had graduate students out doing research projects. The DWR has invested millions of dollars in habitat improvements, and yet we have found that we had to have individual plans for each of our primary sage grouse areas. And they're all different, and they're all locally driven, and that helps create local ownership. But most important is the decisions that are made work for that locale.
The state of Utah rolled out our plan just over a year ago, and at this point we're really in the plan implementation. So we're working on habitat projects. We're monitoring our sage grouse populations around the state. Our whole state plan pivots around it is our ability to manipulate in a positive way our habitats on the ground. To go out and take areas that have had pinyon juniper trees encroach on those. So we're able to go in and remove those trees. We're able to do reseeding in these areas. We've rehabilitated a little over 350,000 acres of sage grouse critical habitat in the state. The things we can control, we're doing a very good job on it, and that's why it's so critical that we're allowed to continue these efforts and not be impeded by a listing of the bird by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
As states develop their own plans for sage grouse management, there is a push from the federal level to make the plans uniform, leaving some stakeholders worried that any decisions made at the state and local level will be overridden at some point anyway.
We think it's pretty disingenuous. The states were all invited by the Secretary of the Interior to start working on state-specific plans. The bird is still managed by the state, by divisions of wildlife throughout the West. And I think it was very appropriate that they were invited to come together with a plan. But the BLM at this point is clearly trying to smooth over the edges and kind of make them all fit together, use uniform language, uniform measures. So we are under the pressure to kind of mold and modify. And some of those pressures, you know, just kind of break the basic principles of what we're trying to do.
It is difficult for us land managers to manage our lands for a single species. The world doesn't work that way. There are so many layers on the landscape.
The variance of any policy that comes out of Washington is a one-size-fits-all. It just doesn't work. Management for sage grouse in Carbon County isn't going to be the same type of management that's needed in Tooele or Box Elder County.
You've got different terrains, you've got so many different factors that fit into every regional area, and to have a management prescription that says this is the way we're going to handle this may not work at all, because maybe fire is a threat in a certain area. Maybe it's predators that's the problem in another area. And so I think we don't have just one management prescription or one management decision made in Washington, D.C. that says this is how we're going to handle this issue.
I don't think it's one agency. It isn't the BLM director or the Fish and Wildlife director. But I think there's a chorus of folks at that level that are saying, we're not going to be able to measure and manage 11 different plans. We've got to have something that gives them all some cohesion. And they're also looking at how can we compare what's going on in Nevada with what's going on in Utah if you're measuring apples and oranges. And the fact is, we have apples and oranges.
People are still working collaboratively to find the best solutions for growing sage grouse, even though they may not agree on every issue. But overall, the planning process seems to be taking the right variables into account.
In most cases, they're really relying heavily on the biology of the species, which is ultimately what the Fish and Wildlife Service is going to make their determination, is the biology of the species. And so that has to be the foundation of whatever plan. You know, you can kind of decorate your house with whatever windows you want, but really you've got to have the foundation that's the critical part. And it's the biology of the species, that it's a sagebrush obligate, that it needs large expanses of sagebrush habitat. So far, the planning process and the plans that have come out have recognized the importance of identifying very specific threats and needs of the sage grouse on a regional level, even though Fish and Wildlife is looking for specific ways that plans measure and manage for the success of the sage grouse. When we return, we will summarize where the process is and identify the potential problems.
Kanab, base camp for your southern Utah adventures. You belong in Kanab.
What would you do with an extra day in Utah Valley? Explore the Wasatch Mountains? Snap a family photo at Bridal Veil Falls. Cool off on Utah Lake or the Provo River. No matter what you're searching for, you can find it in Utah Valley. Bring everyone together.
There is a place where the desert comes alive, where rain breaks forth from solid stone and gardens spring from blistered rock. There is a place with enough color to make a rainbow jealous, where boulders are bigger than buildings and cliffs are higher than clouds. There is a place that will straighten your step, tighten your grip, widen your eyes, and open your jaw. There is a place.
We all assume that the food we eat is safe, but how do you know? Well, it starts on the farm and continues every step of the way to your local grocery store. So when you bring home food, you do so with the peace of mind that it's safe, fresh, and nutritious, thanks to the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food. the guardians of Utah's food supply and sustainable agriculture. Learn more by visiting ag.utah.gov.
Welcome back to the county seat. As we've looked into the possible listing of the sage grouse on today's show, we've seen two different ideas on how management should occur. Now, there is no contention between the different groups on the goal, but the altitude from which they view it makes all the difference. At the grassroots level, specific challenges can be met for the specific habitat and head count. From the 60,000-foot level, the single solution approach might look like all is well, but might actually contribute to large pockets of failure and massive loss of flexibility for multiple and private land use.
The county has different objectives than a range-wide BLM plan because they have a very specific area that they're looking at that is a smaller area. You know, it's not as diverse as a range-wide BLM plan, and so a lot of the time people will look at the range of the science. Even though the science maybe is usually consistent, there is a little bit of range to kind of guide management from that. But ultimately, I think the most of those plans are solid in their biology and keeping the birds' best interest in mind.
Let's give these state plans an opportunity to work. I mean, the governor worked very hard with this state plan, and Kathleen Clark and others, and we haven't even had an opportunity to let that plan move forward and work. The same in other states. Let's hold off the listing decision. Let's give this state plan and these state plans an opportunity to actually do what we believe that they will do.
The final decision will be made in September of 2015 by U.S. Fish and Wildlife as to whether to list the sage grouse or not. The state has put into motion a 5-point plan that will make that decision a favorable one. It includes continuing to study and monitor the populations, continue to restore the habitat and conditions needed to help the species expand, continue to be engaged with the local and federal agencies to pursue administrative opportunities. Fourth, collect evidence and be prepared to challenge U.S. Fish and Wildlife's decision in a legal appeal. And finally, work legislatively to block the implementation or funding at the federal level should a listing occur.
During production of today's program, we learned on Thursday that the U.S. House Armed Service Committee voted to delay listing of the greater sage grouse for at least 10 years. They based this on a report that they got back from the Army that suggests that a listing of the greater sage grouse would impact training operations at military facilities in the western United States. This could be a good thing for the sage grouse because, as we've discussed in today's program, this would give the states time to implement their plans and see if they work.
Thank you for joining us today on the County Seat. We welcome your comments on our social media, and we want you to follow up and refer your friends to our online version of the show. We'll look for you next week on the County Seat. If you like this video, then we invite you to subscribe to our channel, The County Seat. You can do that here. And we invite you to share with your friends. We also invite you to get all the latest up-to-date information by following us on our social media channels. And if all else fails, make sure that you watch The County Seat Sunday morning at 8:30 right here on ABC4 Utah.